All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Mike Engelson. I am the Executive Director of Wisconsin Lakes, the statewide organization that represents lake organizations, and I'm joined by Eric Olson, the UW Extension Lakes Program Director. For everyone else that's just entered the room, Eric, you want to go over the mechanics one more time?
Sure. So we really want people to use the Q&A panel that you'll see somewhere on your menu. It should be next to a box that says maybe participants, or somewhere in the bottom or top, you should see a Q&A panel. And just type in your questions as we're going. Some of the questions I will try to tackle straight away just by writing a response. Some of the questions might be a little bit more complex, and we might hold off to respond them until we can jump in on Mike's presentation and ask him sort of live as we go.
All right, and I have a short presentation. This is actually the second webinar in these issues that Eric and I did. We did one a couple of weeks ago, and in the wake of the Wisconsin Supreme Court's decision last week that ended the statewide stay-at-home orders, I thought it was definitely worth revisiting some of the things that we talked about. So there's some new information in here for those of you that were on the last one. There is also, I do have some of the same slides as we used last time. There we go. So what we'll do today is we'll try to take a look at where we are right now as far as what orders are in place and how that impacts lake organizations. We'll talk about state programs, especially Clean Boats, Clean Waters, and where they are. We'll talk about lake organization meetings again, the ability to hold in-person meetings and should they take place and what circumstances should they take place. And then we'll have plenty of time, I think, to get into questions. So to sort of recap from where we were a week ago, we had really two major orders in place. One was emergency order number 28, and that was called Safer at Home. That one was supposed to be in effect until May 26, and that was the basic stay-at-home order that I think everybody in the state was familiar with. There was also an order that created the Badger Bounce Back sort of phased reopening plan for the state. That was based on meeting certain benchmarks, and it was there were three phases to it, and they were interconnected in that the Badger Bounce Back plan referred to emergency order number 28, and the Supreme Court, as I'll get to in a second, declared that first Safer at Home order unenforceable, which pretty much made the Badger Bounce Back plan unenforceable as well, at least as it applies to citizens. So let's talk about that Supreme Court decision, because that really did sort of change, at least legally, change the playing field. As I said, Safer at Home was explicitly declared unenforceable, and Badger Bounce Back, because of the fact that it sort of related back to Safer at Home, referred to it explicitly to that order, it also is now unenforceable. I think the most important point to take from the case, or at least one of the most important, is that really was a case that was decided based on legal decisions about what the law says about what certain state government entities can do. It had nothing to do with what the current health conditions are. It had nothing to do with an analysis of the orders and whether or not the substance of those orders were correct or proper for the moment. It really was just a legal decision where the Supreme Court decided that the Department of Health Services, the orders were issued under the name of the Department of Health Services Secretary. Of course, that was done somewhat at the direction of the governor. So this all came out of the executive branch, but that those orders could not be enacted without input from the legislature because they were really administrative rules an administrative rule is something, you know, like the shoreline zoning standards that are in place in the state. So the legislature was not consulted when these orders were put out, because the administration felt that that was an order, a health emergency, that they had the authority to make decisions about these sorts of things that the orders covered. The Supreme Court said no, and that meant those orders were immediately unenforceable. So there are no statewide orders in place at the moment, except for the fact that schools are closed for the remainder of the year for reasons that the court didn't really explain. They left that part of the order in place. So schools do remain closed under the state order, but everything else pretty much is not at a statewide level. Counties do have some authority. There are some questions as to how much authority they have, but counties do have the ability to declare health emergencies and put some restrictions out there. And so there's been a variety of responses. We've had a number of counties that have more or less just adopted what the stay-at-home and Badger bounce back plans were. Dane County did that, modified it a little bit. I'll get into that shortly. But you really need to know in terms of holding meetings or whatever kind of activities you're going to undertake in your county, you need to know whether or not the county has an order in place. I think, as far as I know, only counties have done this. I'm not sure why cities would not have similar authority, but I haven't looked into that question all that much. So that's sort of the lay of the land. That's where we are. And that's significantly different than where we were a couple of weeks ago, when the whole state was under the exact same rules. In many ways, it's made it more complicated because there are different standards in different places. And as we'll talk about, there are also, depending on what level of government you're talking to, different parts of government may be employing slightly different standards. So I want to take a moment now and get into sort of just generally what's going on with DNR and where all of the programs that are lake related are at. I'm actually not going to go into specifics on most of them except for Clean Boats, Clean Waters. And the reason is that there's not a whole lot to report out on them except what I've got on this more general slide. So state government is mostly following the Badger bounce back phases. So all of the agencies at the direction of the governor are more or less following what those Badger bounce back phases are. Though there will be more information coming, especially we think, as to how DNR is going to interpret that and how that's going to impact most of the programs at DNR. Might be coming out as soon as tomorrow, but probably next week. If you recall, the original Safer at Home order was supposed to expire on May 26th. Phase 1 has certain things that have to be happening as far as number of hospitalizations and the percentage of new cases and ability to test and things like that for the disease that determine when we're ready to go into phase 1. So we may or may not be there on May 26th, and that may determine whether or not the Evers administration decides that the agencies can go into phase 1. And what I've been told is that even if they are ready to go into phase 1, the phase 1 type activities may not be taken up immediately. So if it's if there's field work by DNR staff that would be allowed under phase 1, there might be a lag in time while the agency figures out exactly how they're going to do it and meet the terms that they have to work under as far as social distancing and safe practices before they're actually able to get going on it. So just because we go into phase 1, let's say that phase 1 is announced on Tuesday, don't expect that everything has opened up to the phase 1 level at that point. And again, Remember, that's only in relation to the state agencies. What's going on in your location, specifically with local governments or what individuals can do, may be completely different. I do know that for a lot of these programs, and you'll see this for Clean Boats, Clean Waters, that the agencies and where they have partners that work on the programs, like with Clean Boats, Clean Waters, UW Extension, there's already been a lot of work done getting ready for that phase one. So for some of them, they may be able to move into things fairly quickly. For some where they have not been able to get to a planning or have been waiting to see exactly what those restrictions are going to be, then there may be that lag time. So let's talk about Clean Boats, Clean Water specifically now. The program is still currently suspended because we haven't gotten to phase one. The hope right from the beginning was that we were going to be into that point by June 1st. And Eric, throughout all of this, if I say anything that you know is obviously wrong, certainly jump in, or if you've got other comments, please feel free to jump in as well. Clean Boats, Clean, we know that there are groups and individuals that are doing some landing monitoring now. That is a volunteer activity, and we want people to follow safety procedures. Right now, you're really not operating under Clean Boats, Clean Waters because that program is not currently active. But even if you are, remember that that high-risk individuals probably don't want to volunteer. Don't be at landings if you feel sick or have COVID-19 related symptoms, all of the things that you hopefully are taking into account as you go about your regular life. Extension is working on getting ready to implement the opening up of Clean Boats, Clean Waters, and when it does, it's going to happen in phases. And Eric, hopefully this document has been released, correct?
It's on our webpage, I believe, yeah.
Yeah. So I included this in the slides so that when you get a printout of the slides, they would still be in here. Let me switch to a better view of this. So this document, again, if you search for Clean Boats, Clean Waters, UW Extension, you'll find the UW Extension pages, and this information and a little bit more is all there. So Aaron and the crew there have come up with some guidelines for conducting watercraft inspections during the pandemic, and I mostly want to look at this table, which sort of mimics this phased introduction idea as to how we're going to allow monitoring to move forward under Clean Boats, Clean Waters. And there's a lot of information in here, but I think the thing that I want to highlight mostly is how these different phases are going to work. So when we get into phase one, which again will hopefully be next week, watercraft inspections may begin at less busy boat landings around the state with groups of 10 people or less. So in most of the phase ones of the different phase plans around the state and following the original Badger bounce back, phase one allowed for gatherings of 10 people or less. So I think this is kind of in keeping along with that and with the idea that if you're at a large landing and we still don't feel that things are at the safe point as far as transmission of the disease to have a lot of people there, Clean Boats, Clean Waters probably can't take place safely at a landing that's actually very busy. That doesn't happen until we get into phase two, and phase two will go into effect the shortest amount of time, 14 days after phase one goes into effect, because those benchmarks have to keep tracking down in the right direction in order for the next phase to happen. It could be, as we go through things, if there's a resurgence of the disease, either statewide or in certain areas that there could be a move back into an earlier phase because it's no longer safe to be in that phase 2 level. But at phase 2, for Clean Boats, Clean Waters, then we expand to landings with groups of 50 people or less. By the time we get to phase 3, we're back into normal inspections, but there still may be some social distancing required. Boaters may still want people to be keeping a physical distance and all of that sort of stuff.
Mike, can we talk through some questions real quick because we're on this?
Yep, go ahead.
Waters. So one of the questions just has to do with this idea that some counties are sort of declaring themselves to be in different phases. So Oneida County says, well, we're in phase 2 now. How does that impact, I guess, Clean Boat, Clean Waters type programming? I'll let you take a stab at it and then I'll try and comment.
Yeah, sure. So that's actually a really good point, is that because the counties were able, after the statewide orders were rendered null and void by the Supreme Court, the counties were able to establish their own procedures, and some of them did use these phase versions of this phase plan, sometimes using the same metrics as the Badger bounce back or maybe something different. So if you're in a county that has that, where there's not a lot of the disease, where there haven't been a lot of cases, that county may actually be farther along in the metrics than say Dane County, which is has had more, or Milwaukee County, which has had more instances. You also have counties like Brown County that initially enacted some emergency conditions, but I believe then rescinded them because they were questioned whether or not they had the legal authority to do so. So I'm not sure that there are any restrictions in Brown County right at the moment. You should be able to get all of that information and find out exactly where your county is and where they are on a phase plan, if they have one, through their health departments. Most of them, I would assume, would have them on their health department websites.
And another, this is going to sound like a nuance, or it's going to sound passive aggressive. You'll notice that I don't work directly for the DNR, nor does Mike work directly for the DNR. We can't really speak for the DNR, but we're trying to interpret what's happening. The DNR also says that they're not in a position to be a public health expert. It is not their call as to whether or not a person should or could feel comfortable at a landing. So the question has come up where, like, right now, one of the questions from Patrick Hayes says they have received plans to follow and they're monitoring on Gunlock Lake in either Oneida or Vilas County. And, would that get reimbursed? Again, the DNR is not going to say, well, did that comply with a different department's standards or with something else? They're just going to say, well, if you did this thing, then if you're satisfying our agreement to do boat landing monitoring, then they're going to be fine with that. What we're trying to do through extension and really through this workshop or through this meeting today is convey what are some of the public health standards that you as volunteers and people who maybe work with staff at landings should bear in mind when you're thinking about the boat landing. None of what Mike does or what I do should be perceived as like enforcement or like we have some ability to necessarily control your activities. What we're trying to do, though, is provide the guidance that you could point to and say, oh, I see. It's organized in a logical fashion. It is being determined by statistics in the field, actual realities about public health. And that is why we are taking this, a step like this at this phase, and then we're broadening it out at the next phase. So in a sense, we're sort of, the guidance that we provide, hopefully in your local community, gives you something to point to other people and say, well, this is kind of what we're doing. This is the guidance that the state has given us. We don't legally need to adhere to it, but it seems to make sense because it is based on the ground situations. So a couple of questions here. It says, someone asked, please define a group of 10 or 50 people. How do you count, i.e. at the boat, land per boat, or what is it? I think it's really if at the landing you expect there to be more than 10 people, then that's a group of more than 10 people. And bear in mind that like nobody at the landing is going to have the ability to know if someone in that group of 10 people is asymptomatic and potentially has, coronavirus and is potentially sharing it with other people. Right now, again, the courts have said, well, the state has no ability to stop those people from gathering. What we're saying is when it hits that point, we don't think anybody should really feel comfortable being present, being close to that group of 10 people, not at the stage that we're at right now with as much uncertainty as we have about the pandemic. And if we could get the numbers under control, then, for that 2-week period till we hit like phase 2, then it might be a larger group of people. But the stage that we're at right now, we would say keep it to a very small group of people. And that's kind of why, again, right now, the guidance, if I had to give it statewide, would say we haven't met the gating criteria. I wouldn't feel comfortable out at a boat landing myself right now. And so why would I expect anybody else to feel comfortable doing that? Someone asked about what metrics have to be met to enter the different phases. Mike, I don't know if you want to click on one of the links and bring up what just what that metrics page or the sort of indicators for the gating criteria and the phases are, but they're basically updated every day by the Department of Health Services. And another point I want to make about this is that these DHS numbers, this isn't like something that, Tony Evers developed sitting by himself in a room somewhere to come up with public health standards. These were the guidelines that the U.S. Center for Disease Control sent out. So they told the states, like, here's some ways that you should probably think about this pandemic situation, and here's how you could monitor real world statistics and then use those as your gating criteria and the phases. So if you looked at the CDC page, you would find similar language about gating criteria and phases. You'd find similar language about symptoms and cases and essentially the healthcare capacity. So here it says hospitals and healthcare. And these are the sort of red and green lights that we're all looking for. We want to see these all turn green. And once they all hit green, then we've met the gating criteria. And then as Mike said, once they're green for 2 weeks, you hit phase 1. And once they're green you're in phase 1. If they stay green for 2 weeks, then you enter phase 2 and et cetera for phase 3. So this is, there's nothing political about this. This is really about the real world statistics that should drive human reactions to a pandemic.
And I think it is important to mention again that your county may be all green on all of these. Hopefully you're seeing the gating criteria on your screen right now. If your county has adopted a plan and it's all green, it may have moved into phase 2, but in regards to state programs and how state government employees are going to react to them, in many cases, how extension employees are going to react to them, they may not be working under the same phase as your county, if your county even has a phased plan in the first place. So it's really become incumbent on us when trying to make decisions over what we can do from a rule and regulation standpoint to know which systems we're under. And I think, as Eric was kind of alluding to as well, it's important then also to be thinking about, just from an individual standpoint, and from your own lake organizations, where does the organization believe you should be at as far as proceeding with different things?
Yeah, so just a couple other practical questions here. Launching is usually done boat by boat, therefore distancing is done because people are separated out from their boats, and that should be fine. In the line of boats, there could be 20 plus people. So what to do or how to handle. I think, again, like this sounds like sort of a larger, more complicated landing area. Remember that Clean Boat Clean Waters is a program designed to kind of satisfy everything from an up north lake with a gravel a parking lot that has maybe parking for 4 boats, all the way down to Lake Geneva, where there may be a multi-acre parking lot and multiple approaches to the boat landing. So it's really hard to give a generic answer as to how to handle this. I would say, again, if there happens to be a large number of people actually outside the vehicles congregating at the landing, that's the type of situation where I'm saying, if you're eyeballing it and saying, oh, there's more than 10 people here, that's where I just wouldn't feel comfortable being there. And there are some southern Wisconsin boat landings where, because of the nature of the way people operate at the landings, there can be more than 10 people. There could be more than 20 people. So those are the guidance that we're giving. Somebody asked in the chat too, did you hear we say we're in phase 1? No, I think what we saw was that there's different counties that might be at different stages. The state has not yet met the gating criteria. So if the court hadn't ruled safer at home to be unconstitutional in terms of how they developed that rule and administered it, we would still be at safer at home for the Wisconsin DNR and for the a lot of state agencies. Basically, we're being told still follow safer at home because that's what our boss is telling us to do. And other private agencies and counties can all handle this a little bit differently as well. Let me see. Someone's saying that everything I'm saying was political. It's your opinion and your feeling. Again, all I can point to is to the DHS numbers. I am trying to keep my opinions to myself. I am trying to reflect sort of what the department has been telling us as well. I guess I don't, Mike, you'd have to help me out here. I didn't see exactly what I said that was political in nature.
Yeah, I think the important takeaway from this, from what I think we're trying to get everyone to understand, is that there are, where you have to understand where the line is, where you're making decisions on how you feel about this situation, what's safe, and how you should proceed based on your own opinion or the opinion of the lake organization, which is, I mean, there are places where Eric and I have opinions that may not be in line with what everyone else has, and it's your lake organization's job to figure out what to do. But there are also a complicated web now of different levels of regulation across the state. In some places, there may be nothing. In other places, there may be county rules. And whatever you're doing in terms of interacting in terms of your expectations for interactions with state government employees, they're, at least for now, following this Badger Bounce Back plan, in which we're not in phase 1 and we're still several metrics away from getting there. So to give another example of it, in Dane County adopted an emergency plan, which is very similar to Badger Bounce Back, but where all of the metrics have currently been met, and unless things change a lot, Dane County will move into phase 1 next week. The state employees that work in Dane County and do work for that are doing state work in relation to that state work probably will not be in the state version of phase 1. So things like some of those monitoring programs, some of the field work that DNR staff would normally be doing may not start up immediately, even though you might hear, hey, my county is into phase 2, or my county has no restrictions at all. The government employees are still under restrictions put on them by the state government itself. So I don't mean to be making any judgments on what anyone decides to do. And I know with Clean Boats, Clean Waters, and with AIS monitoring, because there is an aspect of that is preventative and helps keep species from getting into water bodies. There's there's an argument that that really needs to be happening. And I know a lot of people feel that way. And Wisconsin Lakes has advocated to this state that Clean Boats, Clean Waters be declared as an essential service so that it wouldn't matter what phase that we're in, and it could be implemented fully immediately. There are still going to be limitations on it, though. The state is the people that are putting the program together are still going to have to look at it and say, we need to do this safely. How are we going to do it? So I'm not sure it would end up looking significantly different than it does right now. All right, I do want to, a lot of good questions, and I do want to come back to some of that too, but I want to get through some of the meeting stuff as well. And I do have this last slide on CBCW. I know there have been many questions about the grants and the ability to complete hours. Again, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that there's the hope that there will be the 200-hour requirement will still be met. And even if it's not, there's at least partial reimbursement coming. I think Eric made a good point that if there are groups that have determined that they can do monitoring safely at this point, that the work being done right now is probably reimbursable. I'm not the person that makes that decision, so I'm not going to say is, but my understanding is that it will probably be reimbursable. I know there's been some talk that some extra outreach could be done to waterfowl hunters that might help supplement hours. And regardless, that even if you don't complete all of your hours, that's not going to impact any future grant eligibility or funding levels. And if you choose not to do Clean Boats, Clean Waters at all, and I know I've talked to about as many people that have said we need to go forward with monitoring as we're not going to go forward with monitoring because all of our volunteers are older than 70 or have underlying health conditions and we're not going to put them at risk. In that case, if you talk to DNR, your grant may be able to be extended to 2021. And the link on this slide, which is the extensions Clean Boats, Clean Waters page, has all of this information and contact information for who to talk to at DNR and whatnot. Do you have anything to add to that, Eric?
No, again, there's the link there, and if people haven't gone to the Clean Boats, Clean Waters FAQ, I guess I'd recommend people kind of grab that information. The responses that you'll see there, the information is developed not just by extension, so it's not just Erin McFarland doing this, but she's running this through the DNR and trying to get the best information possible onto the FAQ.
All right, well, let's move on to lake organization meetings under this new situation.
Can I say, Mike, we'll come back to Clean Boats, Clean Waters at the end if we get through all this?
Oh, you bet, yeah. I'm not going to go through actually even all the slides that I have in this presentation because they're mostly duplicative of what I did 2 weeks ago. I think some people may have questions related to those, so I've got them so we can go back to them. And then if you get this slide package, you'll have them as well. But I won't go into quite the level of detail on meetings that I did 2 weeks ago. The big thing that obviously has changed is that there are no longer, in some places in the state, there no longer are prohibitions on having in-person meetings, or the restrictions have been significantly relaxed, or you may be able to predict that they might be as the counties go into the different phases in the near future. So the question then arises, we've spent all of this time talking about learning how to meet virtually. Should we go back and talk about how to meet in person? So a handful of points that I think you need to keep in mind and consider as you're making that decision. The first is what we've been talking about. Know what your county orders require. If your county doesn't allow a meeting of more than 10 people, and you know what your county's metrics are and it doesn't look like they're going to be met, then you can't have that meeting in person because you would be in violation of the county order. Unless you might be able to get a decision from your county that allows you if you're a lake district, maybe as a a governmental body to get a governmental exception, but you really need to look to the orders themselves at the county level, because they're not all the same. They're not all worded exactly the same as the state ones were. So it is worth looking into that at the county level, and maybe even trying to talk to someone in your county government if you have questions about it. A good key maybe to gauge off of is, how are other local governmental bodies handling things in your area? Have towns been freed up, and are they having in-person meetings? What's your county doing for county board meetings and things like that? There's certainly more of an analogy as a lake district, because you are a special purpose unit of government. Less so with the Lake Association, because you're just a nonprofit organization, but at least what the other governmental bodies are doing might be a helpful guide to you to make some decisions. We talked about this 2 weeks ago, and I think I keep coming back to this, that I think is important. Really think about what is essential, and is it something that has to be done now, or can it be put off for a couple of months to see how things are going? So if it's a big decision that is critical and has to happen in order for other things to go on, then you really need to figure out a way to get that decision made. But if you're a lake association with the ability to not hold the committee meeting because there's not a lot that's going to be decided, that might be the easiest way out of all of this problem, is to just wait until things hopefully continue to settle down as we go through the summer. Of course, we don't know that things are going to continue to settle down as we go through the summer. We could have another resurgence of things. So there's that risk that you have to take into account as well. But I still think that the more you can wait on doing things, probably the better. There's a lot of things you can't wait on, however. But if you do think about going back to an in-person meeting, other considerations are people going to come? Are people going to feel safe? Even if you're able to accommodate social distancing, and you hold it in a place that's either, if it's inside, it's large enough, that your organization is small and you're not going to have that many people coming anyway, or maybe if it's larger, you're able to hold it outside in a park. Is most of the people that attend those meetings in an at-risk category that might not be willing to risk coming to the meeting because of that? And how does that affect decisions that are going to get made? That's something that needs to be taken into account. The capability of you to handle the social distancing that's necessary is certainly something to take into account. Do you have a lot of people that have to travel from a distance to attend meetings? And do you or don't you want to promote that? How important is what's being decided? If somebody's going to end up deciding that they would come to the cabin when they otherwise might not because there's a meeting being held. And then many organizations have already gone through the process of figuring out how to do a virtual meeting using something like Zoom, or other online software. If you've already done that, is that going to be good enough to get the job done? And is there a reason to move to an in-person meeting? Or is there a way that you can somehow do a combination of the two, so that people that can't come still feel like they're able to participate if they want to? We talked last time, and these are some of the slides that I'm really not going to talk about a whole lot. We did talk last time about the concept of going virtual in a meeting. And by the way, if you were not able to see that webinar, it is available on the Wisconsin Lakes YouTube channel. There's a recording, so you can go back and watch that one. The thing to continue to keep in mind is that lake associations are not governmental bodies, so they're not subject to the Wisconsin Open Meetings Law, while lake districts are. So whether you choose to be in person or virtual or some sort of hybrid, you still have to follow Open Meetings Law. you still have to meet that reasonably accessible to the public test that we talked about last time. Notice requirements still need to be followed. I think if you're doing a hybrid of both types, it probably is necessary to include the virtual means of attending in the notice. I didn't look into that or check into that with anyone at DOJ, but I would assume that would be the case, is if that capability is being offered, you need to let people know at the noticing level that that's the case. And then remember that with lake districts, especially for the election of commissioners, you do have that problem of having to do that with an in-person vote. So this may have made that simpler for some districts, in that they can hold some sort of in-person meeting and not run afoul of, in at least some cases, any kind of health emergency orders. Again, that comes down to checking with your county and knowing where you are, as they may or may not go through a different phased level of opening. I think that's all I'm going to talk about right now, just so that we have plenty of time to ask questions. There's a whole lot more depth that I could go into in talking about the meetings, and I'm happy to answer questions on that as they come up.
Mike, there's some questions about meetings too, so I want to get those real quick on you.
Yeah.
Did you say something to the effect of you can skip a quarterly meeting?
So if you're a lake association, you have a whole lot more flexibility to skip things and postpone things and not meet timelines on things. As a lake association, you're a nonprofit corporation. You do have to follow what your bylaws say, and you do have to follow the basics of the statutes. But you really do not have as many constrictions as you do as a lake district. As a district, the commissioners do have, you do have to follow what the statutes say, though even there, we talked about this last time, and throw in your opinion too, Eric. We did feel like commissioner meetings could probably be put off. They can't be abandoned. So you have to hold 4, but they don't necessarily have to happen at the time that they always do. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so the idea here wasn't not to do a meeting, but the idea is to either come up with the alternative format, like meeting through Zoom or through a teleconference, which a lot of towns have had to do as well. And counties too. This isn't like unique to lake districts. And then the example we gave earlier too is like, if you had a meeting scheduled and then there was a tornado that came through and knocked out the town hall where the meeting was supposed to happen 2 days later, no one's going to come after you because you failed to hold that meeting 2 days later at the now destroyed town hall. Like, there are circumstances beyond anyone's control that may require you to just sort of reschedule things and to come to a new calendar based on what's happening around you. Does that make sense, Mike?
Mm-hmm. What else?
And really, even the quarterly requirements in statute, like this question comes up often in the winter time, actually, where the quarterly meeting gets snowed out. And so they thought they were going to meet at the town hall, but then there was a blizzard and road conditions were hazardous. And the group can decide, a lake district can decide, do they reschedule that meeting quickly, or do they put the agenda onto the next quarterly meeting? Which is to say, my answer to a lot of people is there's no quarterly meeting attorney general's office that comes out to verify that a lake district truly met its quarterly meeting obligation under statute. We want you all to meet quarterly, and it seems reasonable that if you're going to really carry out your affairs, scheduling a budget and getting everything kind of prepared, you should have to meet quarterly. But at the same time, if like weather prevented you from meeting once, and if the board decided they're going to push that agenda to the next board meeting, no one like from Extension or the DNR or the DOJ is going to come after you because you didn't hold that quarterly meeting. one person asked if it's legal for a lake district to hold its annual meeting at a date later than September 8th. Do you want to touch on that, Mike?
Yeah, so right now that's at best ambiguous, and probably currently it is not allowed unless the district has voted to hold the meeting at a different date at the last annual meeting. So a district could pass a resolution at an annual meeting saying our annual meeting date from now on will always be November 8th or something like that. But that has to have been done at the previous annual meeting. There's also a functional reason why that September 8th date is in place. In part, that I think was set in order to give districts time to get the tax levy information to whichever clerk they need to get that info to, so that the tax bills can be prepared for the next year. One of the things we talked about as an organization early on was to see if we could get some sort of get actually added into a subsequent statewide order an extension of that time because of an extension of that date maybe into October because of the health crisis. At this point, obviously, there are no state orders. The legislature has not made a whole lot of indication that they would be entertaining anything statewide, and they may not even be entertaining any pandemic-related legislation. Though if they do, I'll bring that up. Hopefully, we've got enough ways around the problems at this point, and we'll be moving into the sort of phased openings that most districts will be able to get their meetings in either on time or by that September 8th date.
Okay, I got another question from Dan about the quarterly meetings and kind of how it relates to the court case. So see if you can think this one through. Says statute says the quarterly meeting must be held within or very close to the boundaries of the district. Thus, all virtual meeting option went away with the Supreme Court decision, and a county public health order won't trump that requirement. So it's kind of like saying, now that that court case was decided, can a local government, can a lake district still meet virtually, or do they now have to meet in person?
Sure. There's actually a really easy way around that, I think. And especially when we're getting into these kind of more specific answers to the questions, these really are just my ideas. I'm not presenting these as the absolute answers. And if a district is, or any organization is really worried about how to proceed, talking to legal counsel is probably the safest bet. But really all you would have to do, I would think, in a case like that is, as long as there's one person within, close to the boundaries of the district, if you declare that's actually the meeting location, maybe they're the person that sets up the Zoom call or something like that, then I think you would definitely be okay. Though,
what Mike is kind of getting at, and for Dan's purpose, the question has always come up way before the pandemic as to whether or not a commissioner can participate in a quarterly meeting from a distance location. Can they call into a quarterly meeting, or could they Zoom into a quarterly meeting? So this question has come up before, and people have gone to the Department of Justice, to the Attorney General's office to try to get some clarification on this. And historically, it's sort of hinged on really an esoteric little piece that it's really hard to go into closed session if you have a remote participant. So if someone's on the phone call and you say, we're going into closed session, we don't really know if that phone call is exclusive to the person who says they're on the other end of the line. And so I kind of, what we got from DOJ was the sense that you probably shouldn't do it too much. But that's has also been flying against the headwind of how state government and state agencies have been operating. And so when it came to, again, this is pre-pandemic, meetings of, say, the Board of Regents, meetings of the DNR board, kind of important state level agencies, people frequently would participate remotely into those meetings. So we're kind of scratching our head like, oh, okay, so it's good for you and not for us. Is that how it works? And then in light of what happened under this past spring, DOJ came out with additional guidance that said, you know what, if you want to meet virtually, you should be fine doing that. Or if you want to meet teleconference. And I haven't seen anything that says, oh, well, then let's now find out if that DOJ guidance is still valid in light of the court case. Do you have any sense of that, Mike? Have you heard, like, amongst local government people, is that anything they're talking about?
I mean, I guess I haven't heard anything.
Yeah. So to Dan's point of it being an all virtual, Mike's answer is, well, it can be mostly virtual. Like if there is someone at the town hall sitting by themselves with a computer, and that was the location of the meeting, and everybody else was remotely participating, then you could satisfy sort of the location requirement.
Yeah, and I even have a hard time, I guess, seeing that if challenged, if there was a reasonable explanation why the meeting was all virtual and everyone was in Chicago that was participating on the virtual call, as long as it's satisfying open meeting requirements and there's a reasonable accommodation for the public to listen in as is required, then I guess I'd be surprised that physical location key would be made so important that it would invalidate the act, anything that happened at that meeting.
So then a couple of questions, Mike, about this annual meeting. The idea of voting comes up. Like the advice has been to push your meeting back as far as possible, but some people are like, look, let's go ahead and have sort of a virtual annual meeting. Where are we at on that? Is that still even recommended? And if you were to do that, can you really navigate the challenges of approving a budget and holding an election?
So the election piece is the really hard one because effectively paper ballots or some sort of actual ballots are required because of the statutory requirements of Chapter 33. There are also there's a new law that requires ballots to be counted and announced at the meeting, that has some recount provisions that if there are over 100 ballots that have been cast in an election, a request from a recount would actually go to the local clerk, would not be taken care of by the district at that point. And so the ballots would have to be put in a sealed container of some sort and taken to the clerk. And if the voting was somehow done virtually, then I'm not sure how that would happen. You also have the problem with a virtual meeting of knowing for sure that the people that are doing the virtual voting, however you're doing it, actually are authorized to vote in the district. So the commissioner elections are still very difficult. Other aspects of the virtual meeting, I don't think that there's anything on its face as far as open meetings law that would prevent the annual meeting from being a virtual meeting. I think some districts actually do their budget votes by a voice vote. So there are means within some electronic meeting systems that would probably allow for that level of voting to occur, though I admit that's difficult, and I haven't heard of a district that has made a decision of exactly how it would try to go about holding those sorts of votes in a virtual setting, but it's certainly possible. Um, so the two options that we've given for districts, suggested options, I'm sure there are more ideas, smart ideas out there as well that could be found. But one is that a district would, instead of holding its annual meeting, hold a special meeting at which it could then vote on an amendment to the existing budget. So whatever financial things have to happen before it can hold its annual meeting can still happen under the old budget. That is a power that is provided within the statutes, and then you get around having to elect commissioners. The other, probably less elegant way that is sort of like whether or not you can get around having a completely virtual commissioners meeting where the commissioners are all not in the district, would be to hold an annual meeting, but instead of electing commissioners, pass a resolution as a district that says we can't elect commissioners at this meeting. We're going to push that off until a special meeting at a time when we can. And then you can vote on the budget. The advantage of that option is that you get that annual meeting out of the way and you can check that box off before September 8th. And then if to vote on commissioners, you have to wait until October to do that, you can.
Yeah, so that kind of answers Karen's question too. And really, it's not it's not really possible for you to cancel your annual meeting for 2020. You do need to figure out one way to do this or another. The question has come up before of like, well, what happens if a lake district fails to hold an annual meeting? And this is a question before pandemic. This has nothing to do with really anything happening today. It's just that we have a number of lake districts out there that are something equivalent to zombie lake districts. They formed in order to tackle a particular challenge at the time. It could have been in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And there was a lot of excitement around the lake district at that time. And then they tackled their challenge, and somehow those people started to fade away. Nobody was running for commissioner seats. Pretty soon they weren't having quarterly meetings. Pretty soon they didn't have the wherewithal to organize an annual meeting. Now there's no annual meeting, there's no quarterly meetings, there's no budget. The Lake District itself does not disappear. The Lake District itself can only be dissolved by the process laid out in statute. And so it remains sort of on the landscape as a zombie lake district that may or may not be capable of being resurrected into life again if needed. I haven't heard a good example of a district going through the resurrection process, but we think it's possible. That otherwise, why not just say, if after 3 annual meetings a lake district ceases to exist? Right now, statute just says it can only be dissolved if formally dissolved. And we've talked through maybe some possible ways that they could do that. I think you'd want to have a lot of agreement amongst the people as to how you're going to bring the district back to life. I do want to comment real quick about an annual meeting style that's going to be happening, I think, this weekend at, was it Eagle? I sent you the information.
Yeah, I was actually going to comment on the same thing and could also only remember that it was Eagle Lake.
It's in Racine County.
Yeah.
So if anyone wants to put in the chat what lake we're talking about, what they did an interesting thing. They want their meeting to be as short as possible. And so they actually produced YouTube videos that sort of introduce some of the content that typically takes time during their meeting. So you can go to a pre-meeting informational session online at your leisure. And then when you get to the meeting, it's kind of like, let's just get this done with and everybody go home. So they're trying to make it safe as possible in that direction. And then they're also holding it at a large venue that will allow people to maintain social distance and hopefully to feel comfortable participating in that meeting. So I'd point to that as an example too, is to start thinking about creative ways that your annual meeting can be done. If historically you thought you were all crammed into a town hall or some sort of small building, maybe think outside the box and think about bigger spaces where maybe even people can somehow stay in their vehicles or participate in those ways.
I think last time too, Eric, someone asked the question of, could you convene your annual meeting pass the budget, get that kind of stuff done, and then recess it and reconvene it later on to elect the commissioners. And I don't have a great answer as to whether or not that would work. But in all of these sorts of things, you kind of have to look at what's the consequence of getting caught for doing something that you weren't supposed to do. And again, I think if you're operating with a reasonable explanation of why you've decided to stretch the statutes in this way, Chapter 33 has a lot of ambiguity. There are, for instance, towns are allowed to recess their annual meeting, though I'm not sure if they're allowed to make any decisions. But if you could argue to the court, if the meeting was challenged, that, well, that's why we did this, was because we had to have our budget passed, and we had to meet virtually, but we couldn't elect the commissioners, and so our only recourse was to say we're putting the annual meeting on hold and then we're reconvening. And at that reconvention, as long as you check people in again and make sure that they're valid voters in the district, it may very well be okay. And I'm not sure what the consequence could be other than a directive by the court to elect commissioners, because that's the thing that you haven't done. So, I guess it could be that the court could throw out the decision on the budget at the original annual meeting. So there might be some risk.
So a follow-up question about what you said about maybe delaying to a special meeting the actual balloting for a commissioner seat. Would that, can you extend the term of commissioners? Is that sort of what would happen in that case? That the person whose term is coming up would be extended until the next special meeting? And Mike, do you see any legal problems with that?
I think we're pretty comfortable that if a commissioner was not, the commissioner serves until the next election, essentially. So we're pretty comfortable that that would be, even if the dates were extended, that would be held as okay. Again, it's being done for a reason.
Not for a nefarious reason, but
right, exactly. So
I think, again, for a district that feels that this is going to be highly contentious, the overall advice would be to start talking to counsel, to start working with an attorney. We'd like to say that we can somehow give you legal advice, but we really can't. We're trying to answer questions as best we can about sort of how to operate lake districts in these very unusual circumstances. In this case too, if it's a lake district that has a lot of sort of Hatfield and McCoy type situations, I don't know what to tell you, except you're probably going to be best off engaging legal counsel to make sure that if something didn't go well, or if people don't agree, that you're going to be on more or less solid footing if the decision gets challenged. Which is another way to say that a lot of work that happens in lake districts isn't Hatfield and McCoy, isn't sort of long knives drawn and people ready to attack the lake district. Most of what's happening in most lake districts is agreed upon by just about everybody. And so it's hard for us to spend a lot of time on sort of those circumstances where things may be really contentious compared to other folks who are just trying to kind of roll along and get things done.
Yeah. I had another point and it now slipped out of my mind. It'll come back to me.
Because Dan has this question: why are we discussing ways to get around the statutes? I mean,
well, I mean that's a good point, and there are a lot of people that would argue that's what the statute says, and you have to do it. When the statute doesn't allow you to do something that you can actually do, when the statute prevents you, when the situation in the world prevents you from being able to do the thing legally that the statute requires you to do, there's a problem. You know, I suppose one way that you could solve it is go to court and try to get an injunction, some sort of injunctive relief that would allow you to do that. But most districts are not going to go to that extent. And so what you do is really something that happens in many, many areas of law, which is you kind of play with things at the edges. And it is stretching the statutes. And you know, you're absolutely right, Dan, that that is a thing that there is some risk involved with that.
And he, you know, Dan had a follow-up question about the commissioner, or a statement about the commissioner, that they do not serve until the next election. He said, we had that discussion with DOJ. Your term ends when it expires, election or not. So I don't know what level of discussion they had with DOJ. I do know, for example, the Board of Regents right now has people whose terms have expired, but they're still serving on the Board of Regents at the state level. So I know that doesn't directly apply, but these are elected commissioners elected to a term. The maybe a way to get at this is like, well, you'd like to say it's a 2-year term that runs, how to put it, other local governments have much more definitive dates of the elections, right? The terms are sort of in that spring election that's on the calendar. With lake districts, for example, though, a lake district could have decided a year ago that they're going to reschedule the annual meeting from the end of May until the end of September. And then I guess maybe, Dan, you can respond if this gets to your question, like, does then that district lose a commissioner during the summer between May and September when that person's term has expired, but there hasn't been an election to fill that seat? And then if you did have a smaller, let's say you had a 5-person district and 2 of them are appointed and 3 of them are elected and 1 of them is vacant because of this, how do you fill the vacancy? Or do you just operate with only those 4?
One thing that I think helps make that that option potentially safer is that the decision to put off the vote for the commissioners is not being made by the commissioners, it's being made by the people at that meeting. So it's being made by the district voters. They're the ones that are saying, we know we have this statutory thing that we can't meet at this meeting, so what else are we going to do? We're going to push this off. You know, this gets to the idea of you have to make decisions as your own organizations as to how comfortable you feel with different things. We've talked to a number of groups that have decided to go ahead and hold virtual meetings and figure out how to make that happen. And I've heard from districts that have said, oh, we're so happy that this our restrictions are lifted. We're going whole hog on having an in-person meeting and doing that the best we can.
Yeah, so Dan says the term goes to the annual meeting. So again, that term would be extended throughout that summer. I guess Mike would probably entertain seeing the Department of Justice communications around this. If that's the case, I mean, it really does foreclose any option to sort of try to extend the meeting. And to the question of, are we trying to get around statutes? The idea here, this is a tricky one. We're trying to promote democratic participation in the Lake District annual meetings and really in all the things around lakes. We're trying to make it possible for as many people as possible to participate. A lot of you know it's already kind of difficult to get people to come to annual meetings to participate at the level that you wish they would. This situation doesn't make that any easier, right? And we know the demographics of the folks who own property around lakes who are likely in a district. They tend to be older folks. And to Dan's question earlier about, well, does it matter whether they feel comfortable or not? I mean, if you hold a Lake District annual meeting and nobody shows up at all, you're right that technically that's going to be a legal annual meeting, and the budget might get passed on a vote of 3-0. And maybe that Lake District has 3,000 property owners in it. But I would argue that that's not really the spirit of Chapter 33 in the Lake District law. That the spirit of the law is about trying to get as many people to come to those annual meetings. And that's kind of why evidence of that is about why statute requires it to be held during the summer. Is that if people can't be, if people aren't going to be around in northern Wisconsin because they're all in Arizona and Florida, and you hold your annual meeting in December, like statute says, no, try to hold it in the summer because we want to maximize the ability of people to participate. And this public health situation, you could take the court case and set it onto the side and say, will the people show up to this meeting? Is anybody actually going to come? And then to a question earlier about sort of boat landing monitoring, I don't think anybody wants to preside over a Lake District meeting that later was found to be an actual problem. That was found to be, one person came who didn't know that they had a virus, but came anyway, right? Because they didn't know, and they participated in that meeting. And there's a lot of, at a typical Lake District meeting, there might be a lot of talking and yelling and shouting. And those might be the circumstances under which some people actually pick up the virus from them. No one wants to say, oh yeah, it was that Lake District meeting 2020 in the summer, four people became infected, and then they went home and they infected more people. I don't know, why. It's hard to say about why we want to get around statute. What we want to do is maximize public health and maximize participation, not so much to minimize following the law, but to somehow maximize everybody's engagement in lakes. A similar question, Mike, and kind of gets to what are we given here? This is recommendations and advice. If someone comes to a boat landing and they're a Clean Waters volunteer or a staff person, and they say they don't want to wear a mask, what should a lake association do in those situations?
For the most part, I don't believe that they're that a district, an association almost certainly, and a district probably would not have authority to require wearing of a mask. I suppose it could be if it's a stated policy with that, if you're going to do monitoring either as a volunteer or for us, you have to agree to certain things that you're going to abide by, and one of them is wearing a mask. And if you don't wear the mask, they could be told, we're sorry, you can't volunteer to do this for us anymore. Is that getting at the question?
Yeah, I mean, again, people are facing a lot of tough decisions just around this, right? It's not an easy time, I think, to be at the landings. I think it depends, again, the DNR and extension don't have any real direct supervisory responsibility over people at the landings. This Clean Waters program developed because it really saw local groups as being champions for making this happen. And we have to sort of trust and empower local lake groups to make their decisions, but for us to not really, it's not our role to second guess or to supervise how they're doing that.
Right, and if I'm not wrong, Eric, even the plan that you all have put out for Clean Boats, Clean Waters suggests masks, but does not require them. Am I correct?
Right. Again, we can't require anything.
Right.
So part of what we're doing is we're saying, but we can make them available. So we figured out a way through our budget that we can make some masks available. So we wouldn't want someone to say, well, the reason I'm not wearing a mask is because nobody got me one or I don't have one. Like if a boat landing monitor wants to wear a mask but just doesn't have access to one, then let's solve that riddle right there. Yeah, and Dan just has some more points about there's multiple viewpoints. A lot of these are opinions. They have to be considered, but you'll never be wrong if you follow statute.
That's true. So if you follow this, so let's say that the legislature accepted the, so let's say that we get a resurgence of cases and the legislature says, okay, we really do have to shut things down. And the safer at home order is resurrected as an emergency rule, and it's passed by the legislature and it goes into effect. And it's clear that a lake district cannot, under that rule, hold an in-person annual meeting. You now have a problem of statutory conflict. And even in these cases where it's not that clear, I still think you have some statutory conflict.
Trying to go back up to some of the earlier Clean Boat, Clean Waters questions. Some people did have some questions about safety. I do have one actually, a question that kind of relates back to the quarterly meeting. A group that normally meets monthly, normally pays their bills monthly. Is there another way for the treasurer to pay the bills, either without direct permission for each bill, or can the board give some sort of permission to the treasurer so that he can pay bills without a meeting if necessary? Mike, do you have a sense on this? I think every local unit of government is under the same concept that the treasurer pays bills at the direction of the board. In the Lake District Treasurer trainings, we do talk about how the board can give permission in advance to pay certain bills, particularly if they're in the budget. And there's even a way to pay, I think, smaller bills that may not be in the budget. So if, for example, the Lake District needs to get $30 of postage, you don't need to hold a quarterly meeting to authorize just the $30 of postage. You can set a dollar amount threshold that the board is comfortable with for the treasurer to operate under.
And I think the key there is that the board has made a decision as to what that threshold is and how that can proceed. So there's, even if it's been past practice to only do it to pay monthly based on the direction of the board at its meetings, if the board could, hold a meeting and create even just emergency payment rules or something like that, that might be a way to solve that problem.
We do have the video for the Lake District Treasurers is up on, and the PowerPoint slides are on the convention archives. Mike, are you going to compose sort of a follow-up email that includes these slides and maybe those links to the people who registered today?
Sure. Yep, I can do that.
That'd be great. Another question, just going back to the Q&As. Someone asked about eyelids, Mike, and I know this has been something you've been thinking quite a bit about. What do you see going on with eyelids in the summer, and how does this sort of fit into what we want people to be doing at boat landings?
Well, so for those of you who aren't familiar with what eyelids are, they're mechanical camera and an audio device. So they take pictures of boaters as they're as the boats are going into the water at the landings, and then they can be set to broadcast an audio message that talks about decontaminating their boat or whatever you want. The video is actually then monitored by the company that runs eyelids, and if there are violations, potentially those could be forwarded to the organization, or they can be forwarded to law enforcement potentially. I'm not sure whether or not there have ever been any violations that have resulted in citations from that in Wisconsin. There's some questions over the how enforceable those things are. Certainly, in a time when having people at the landings is not viable, or is less viable than it has been in the past, having a mechanical voice there to at least somewhat do the work is certainly something that can be looked at. There are some issues that the state is working through, dealing with what kinds of, where the eyelids are being allowed. There's some conflicts in the Northern Highlands State Forest in northern Wisconsin that whether or not the audio can be played at particular landings. So there are issues along with that. Sort of part and parcel with that is the question of decontamination stations. So can you put out if your organization has put out just the bleach bucket solution, how often does that do the tools need to be sanitized and cleaned? Which is of course somewhat ironic considering that it's a bucket of bleach solution. But all of those kinds of questions have to come into play. If you have some of the mechanical units like the CD3 decon stations, how did those get cleaned? What level of liability does the entity that's putting those things out entertain if someone can show that they got sick from them? All of these things again are kind of the level of risk and the questions that you all as lake organizations kind of have to answer on your own to determine the level of risk that you want to take on.
Trying to look for another unanswered question here. It's kind of been trying to move through these. One person asked, when a lake straddles two counties with a landing in each county, and the lake association's trying to have a boat landing strategy for each county, but they may have different policies about whether or not a landing is, if people can be doing clean waters, I guess. It says, can a district select a coherent strategy even if it disagrees with the county program?
That's a perfect example of how the patchwork approach is problematic, because the answer is probably no. The county has the ability to, until proven otherwise at least, to set its own sorts of orders and its own restrictions on how launches might be allowed. And so it really, in some places, may come down to launch by launch. There may be differences in the way that the state ends up managing landings as opposed to locally owned landings as well. So you could get, if you have a lake that is in a couple of counties that has a state forest landing on it or something like that, you could have 3 different regimens at 3 different landings. And unfortunately, that's probably something that the lake organization will just have to live with and figure out how to handle.
Yeah, I do know in talking with the DNR folks, they just said, it's just going to be really difficult for this year to be a quote unquote normal year. A lot of groups, whether it's the state agencies or whether it's county government, and certainly lake districts and lake associations, were encountering a lot of uncertainty that we just haven't been familiar with before. It's uncertainty just at a heightened level, and so it helps to say, like, let's breathe and think through what we're going to do next. John Richter had a question about liability. It says, could you address potential liability to an employer like a town if they hire, say, an older person like a retiree to do clean boat, clean waters? Mike, have you gotten any questions about sort of like where employment law plays into this and workers' comp?
Yeah, I don't, I have, and I don't have good answers yet. I think that might be a good topic for another session, possibly even next week, because I think more and more people are beginning to think about the question of, where are we exposing ourselves to liability if somebody gets sick, not only from a worker standpoint, but also from a volunteer standpoint. You can argue that as a governmental organization, a lake district may have some sovereign immunity that governments generally have. lake associations as nonprofit organizations have some sort of general liability. I did talk to someone recently who made the point that because the threat of getting sick should be so well known, there's a level at which the individual has some responsibility for deciding whether or not to take on risk. So, especially if you're pointing that out to the people that are volunteering or that you're paying, it might be that helps mitigate the organizational liability. I have heard that a couple of insurers have announced that they will not be covering COVID-related claims in the future. I think that's probably just upon renewal of policies. I don't know that that's something that they would be able to change in the middle of the stream, so to speak, but certainly the insurers seem to be thinking that this might be a rising problem, and we have to figure out as lake organizations what that means to us. So I don't have excellent answers yet, but I am working on that question.
I think, Mike, what we learn out of each one of these is that there's topics that need to get delved into more deeply. As you mentioned, the DNR is planning to have, I think there's like a departmental meeting on Tuesday next week to kind of talk about where they're at as an agency. And it's kind of like after that point, a lot of implications might come out to play. Some of them are going to affect things like Clean Boat, Clean Water. Some of them are going to affect things like Citizens Lake Monitoring Network. It would make sense for us to kind of get our ducks in a row to maybe specifically dive into those topics as we get closer and closer to, I guess, really busy boating season. We know like this weekend is probably going to be pretty busy again. And again, the advice from the DNR is to say there's, we always knew we couldn't be at every landing all the time. That was not really the intent. Clean Boat, Clean Waters is also just meant to change the norms of the boat landings. There is sort of this hope that folks who come to boat landings think a little bit deeper about what Clean Boat, Clean Waters means or what aquatic invasive species are all about. Now that we've all had sort of a national and global discussion about how things get spread from one place to another and how to limit the spread, the idea is for boaters, I think, to just more or less take it on themselves much more meaningfully than they have in the past. And we know that our numbers are actually pretty good in Wisconsin as far as the rate of transmission of AIS in our lakes, but maybe we can plan on maybe seeing if someone from DNR can join us next time. We might even bring someone in from Clean Boat, Clean Waters and have a more detailed discussion of what the rollout plan is going to look like. And that may mean this next meeting has to happen pretty soon. It might be as soon as a week from today. We've been sort of operating on the fly to respond to changes on the landscape.
Yep, I think you can be pretty sure that we'll have another one of these that will cover some topic next Thursday at 4. This seems to be our time to all get together to talk about pandemics and lake organizations. So I think we probably have reached our time. So I'll thank Eric again for joining in with the helpful commentary, and the recording of this will be up. I'll try to get it up on our YouTube channel yet this evening. Like Eric said, I'll get an email out to all of you who participated with the important links. And I'll actually include the slides from the last session, the first session that we did as well. So went into a lot more depth on virtual meetings and how they interplay with open meetings law. So that might be of interest to some people. And you can follow our COVID-19 related coverage on wisconsinlakes.org as I post information. Especially, I imagine there will be a lot coming up in the next week, like Eric said, with decisions made by DNR and whatnot. We'll try to get at least links out to people with all of the information that they need to know what's going on. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for coming, and maybe we'll talk to you next week.
All right. Thank you, Mike.